Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Remotely Speaking. In this podcast episode, we are joined by Jodie Goulden, the head of OrgDesign Works. Now, Jodie has worked across the globe in different countries and in different contexts. She has more than 10 years leadership experience, and she helps companies to reduce bureaucracy so they can work more agilely. Jodie's experience ranges from Canada to Australia to Singapore. So welcome, Julie, and thank you for joining our session on business redesign. And she's going to be telling us more today about how you can redesign your business to work more agilely and remotely, which is very much a hot topic. We've seen businesses do it to varying extents due to COVID, but Jodie's going to be telling us more about how you can design your business period for the future world of work, given a lot of problems companies have run into trying to do this as well. So welcome, Jodie, and thank you for joining us.
It's great to be here, Rochelle. Thanks.
Brilliant. So can you tell us a bit more about your background? How did you get into working in this area?
Sure. I'm Australian, and after working in different places in the world for the last 20 years, I'm based now in Germany, which I love. It's a great place to live here, and also a good place from which to have a global business. So I founded my own company. It's called OrgDesign Works, and it's about helping organizations to design better ways of working. Prior to that, I worked for a long time in big multinational companies, and I feel like I was really lucky to work not just all around the world, but in many different leadership roles, mostly in the area of HR. And what I think that really helped me to have is a deep understanding of how organizations work. So I got to work in the corporate headquarters, I got to work out on production sites, I got to work in operational HR for a region, and also with the business on transformational projects like integration of an acquired company. So that really helped me to see the organization from all different angles, and probably what led me to be working now in organization design, because at some point as a leader, I think I recognized that I was investing most of my energy in navigating the bureaucracy of the organization, finding my way through the hierarchy, the silos, dealing with the complexity of a big matrix organization. And so maybe, for a project that might take 3 months of actual work, it could take 2 to 3 years to get it implemented. But I mean, I'm not complaining about it. I actually loved my work, and I feel like I was, getting really good at that. Like many leaders who get to be very good at navigating themselves around the hierarchy and the bureaucracy. But at one point, I thought to myself, why do we have to be so good at this? Why can't we just be good at designing organizations without all of the bureaucracy and hierarchy that's kind of getting in our way? And so then I learned that we can design organizations better, and that the way that we design organizations has a huge impact. So that's kind of what got me to where I am now.
Wow, that's amazing. And I can identify with a lot of the issues that you've mentioned there around the bureaucracy, because I know a lot of companies since COVID, it would have been for some very knee-jerk reaction who would have been more closed off to remote working. All of a sudden they had to recalibrate very suddenly to remote working, and now you have a case where persons are returning to the office, and that old let's say traditional mentality is taking over, and people are going again, okay, let's fit back into the old organizational model, which is not necessarily perfect for the ongoing and rapidly changing environment, given especially thoughts and worries about a potential second wave. So I totally agree with what you're saying. So how do you think these organizations have come to be so bureaucratic? Why are they standing in their own way? What's happened there?
Well, I have to say, actually, that bureaucracy and hierarchy is not by itself a bad thing, really. And we deliberately design it that way. So we made it like that.
Yeah.
And that's going back to the second half of the 19th century
Yeah.
in the Industrial Revolution, when assembly lines and mass production
Yeah.
helped manufacturing firms to really grow.
Mm.
And they actually figured out that this, let's say, the pyramid hierarchy and the model of bureaucracy was really successful. That's what made them successful.
Yeah.
And so it works in a way, and it continued to be a successful model for a long time.
Yeah.
And even now, we still see it. Like you say, we still see that model with the big organization chart in a lot of traditional organizations, even though maybe we could talk about why it might not be still the best model today.
Yeah. Yeah, that's fair enough. So what, in terms of looking at that old model that you mentioned, what are the specific elements of the bureaucratic model that, let's say, presents barriers to more agile and remote working in particular, especially when we're also talking about independent working, so engaging external stakeholders as well? What are the specific elements?
Mm-hmm. Well, in a traditional hierarchy, information is following, the information flow is following the organization chart in a way. So leaders of teams are compiling information, say, about project progress, and then they report that to their boss, who compiles the information again and reports it to their boss. And then that continues through all those layers of management, which in some big companies might be 8 or 9 management layers, until it gets to the top, where all the information is analyzed and decisions are made, and then they're communicated back to the organization, again, by cascading it through all those layers of management. And so you're probably thinking, okay, that sounds crazy and doesn't make any sense, right? But well, to me, who was working in that kind of environment, it kind of does seem logical to many people. And it even feels maybe risky to say, okay, we're going to let go of all that controlling of the information, and we're going to allow people to make decisions and act in different ways in all parts of the organization. And even more risky, it feels like, people who are working remotely, we can't even see them. So to people who've kind of grown up in that kind of situation, it does feel scary. And maybe that's one of the reasons why even companies are trying to change. There's still a lot of underlying resistance to that.
Yeah, it's definitely a mindset that's developed over the years. Like I was telling another colleague that often the issue that always arises is an issue of trust. How can we trust persons when they're working remotely? And yeah, and you mentioned like the classic communication problem that's associated with very bureaucratic organizations in terms of being able to make quick decisions in this changing environment. But yet you have that issue where you have to cascade down levels before you can actually get an answer. So what do you think then in terms of technology? Because we've seen that technology is really one of these drivers of change, and let's say the pace at which the change is occurring. So in these bureaucratic organizations, how does technology play a role in modernizing these companies and also breaking down that mindset?
Yeah, well, I think that technology could be the key, actually, to the changes, and maybe one of the reasons why we're seeing a lot of companies actually making that shift now. So, because with technology today, you don't need that information to go through the hierarchy. You can actually have information available to everyone, online, on time, on demand. So in an organization, you've got people who are smart, educated, capable, talented, and now they all have access to this goldmine of information, right? So people have everything they need to be able to be empowered to make decisions and take action in all the different parts of the organization. And so we don't need that hierarchy and bureaucracy anymore to help that information to flow. And I think that as people we're seeing it obviously in different places where technology, once it gets established, once people start using it and feeling more comfortable with it, then the trust is increasing.
Yeah.
And so that lets us to let go of it. But I think the problem is that a lot of big organizations, they're rolling out the technology,
Mm.
but they haven't done the redesign of the bureaucracy and the hierarchy. So sometimes
Yeah.
people be implementing technology systems, but they're kind of copying the old ways with lots of levels of approval and that kind of
Mm.
thing. So
Yeah.
along with the technology has to come the change in the design. And like you
Yeah.
say, then the mindset change can
Mm.
evolve.
Yeah, you really touched an important point there. One of our past guests as well, Jeremy, he mentioned that it's not just digital transformation we should be thinking about in redesign, but what you mentioned, it's an entire business transformation that comes with. Yes, you have the infrastructure, and it's important to know how to use the infrastructure, but also the human skills and the human mindset shift needs to really make that infrastructure work for you. So I absolutely agree with that. So then what would you say to a bureaucratic leader who is worried about the impact of that sort of redesign? How do you get that person to break down that sort of mindset? What would you say to that person?
Yeah, well, I think that with leaders, actually, when I'm talking to leaders in organizations, there are a lot of them who are actually really inspired by
Mm.
new ways of working,
Yeah.
and they believe in empowering people to decide and act, and they totally want to leverage all the diverse talents. So they've kind of got the idea
Yeah.
of it. They
Yeah.
really want to go in that direction. And to be honest, that's the people that really inspire and motivate me to do my job. But what I think is that it's difficult to know where to start when you're right
Yeah.
in the middle of things. So if you're a middle manager or a senior manager in a big company,
Mm.
you've got so much pressure, so much day-to-day pressure, and the complexity is
Yeah.
overwhelming. And so you might be thinking, well, where should I start? How do I even start?
Mm.
I'm very optimistic about the leaders in organizations that they want to make the change, but
Yeah.
we need to help them.
Yeah.
So I always talk about kind of 3 practical tips, for changing mindset, which is purpose, mindfulness, and listening.
Mm.
For leaders to start with their own teams.
Yeah.
Shall I talk a bit more about
Oh,
those?
definitely. I'm intrigued.
Okay, so with purpose, if you think about if you're, and I believe that you are motivated by purpose,
Mhm.
Rochelle. So you know how motivating it is when you know the reason for your work, and
Yeah.
that really gets you going.
Yeah.
And it's not just a feeling. There's really evidence that that's what motivates people. So as a leader, if you're a leader, it's a great idea to spend time with your team and have a conversation and invite people to share what motivates them and what's their own purpose and what contribution they want to
Mhm.
make. And then start the conversation with the team, maybe to come up with a team purpose. It
Mhm.
doesn't have to be, super fancy and marketing blurb, but just so the team is creating something together. And also not that the boss is coming up with something and trying to inspire and motivate people, but do it
Yeah.
together.
Yeah.
Because that helps it helps the team to be effective, but it also helps people to be able to trust each other to work
Mm.
in different areas because everyone knows what the common direction is.
Yeah.
Um, the
And-
second
Yeah.
the second thing is mindfulness,
Mm.
which for me means being able to bring your whole self to work.
Yeah.
So, when you're showing up to work, whether that's in person or whether it's in a remote working situation, if you're able to talk with your colleagues about what's on your mind, what's your mood, then we relate to each other at a deeper human level, right? And that
Yeah.
helps us to work together.
Yeah.
So for leaders, there's really simple things you can do. So people kind of think, oh, that sounds a little bit difficult, but if a leader, I would say to a leader at the start of your next meeting,
Mm.
just start with a check-in round
Yeah.
to ask how everyone is doing.
Yeah.
And if people have never done that before, they might think, oh, that sounds a bit strange. But I would say just try it and then notice the difference it makes in the meeting to the way that people are working together.
Mm. Okay. Yeah. And then you mentioned listening. All right. Is that part of it?
Listening.
That fits in with that as well.
Listening is number 3. So you know, I think we all know that listening is a really important skill, and maybe we've even had some training or we're trying to be better listeners. But in a work situation, it can be much more difficult to actually apply that. You know, it's easier said than done because, you know, if you've ever been, have you ever been in a meeting maybe where people are all trying to talk at once and everyone's trying to make their point? And I've even had performance feedback that told me you need to be more assertive to make your point, and you need to present information in a way that no one is going to question it, which is pretty much the opposite of good listening, right?
Yeah.
And there's a quote I love that is from Stephen Covey, and it goes, I think, people don't listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah.
Um,
Absolutely.
so, and I think for a leader, it's not just about being a good listener yourself, but it's about designing the work that enables everyone to listen and everyone to have a voice. So
Yeah.
if you're making a difficult decision, for example, ask people to just reflect for a little bit and then invite everyone to give their feedback. So you don't want it to be that it's just you have one great leader who creates a good atmosphere, but you want it to be in the DNA of the way that you work and the
Yeah.
way that you do things.
So
Yeah.
what would you say, how can organizations also improve that process for persons that, let's say like an independent contractor that they hire? Because I know in situations where I've spoken to remote workers who are not a part of that company, and they say that they don't feel engaged, they don't feel included in that framework of these companies. They feel a bit unseen, and also sometimes their understanding of what the work is versus what their client expects or that company is so different. So what would you say in terms of those principles? How can those also be inclusive of those who work with the company, not just in the company?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the big opportunities right now is what we're learning about working remote.
Yeah.
And in one sense, it comes down to those three things I talked about are all about psychological safety,
Yeah.
which is a bit of a big topic, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But something that is, for me, really fascinating about the shift to remote work that's happened right now is that we're starting to see some emerging evidence that a lot of the time productivity is increasing, actually.
Yes. Yeah.
So INSEAD is doing some early research on this, and just this week a report came out from Boston Consulting Group, and I just read it yesterday. Have you seen it?
Not as yet.
I'll send it to you. I think you would really like it. So, but what all of it is showing is that people are saying that they've been more productive as a result of shifting to remote work. Not everyone,
Yeah.
but maybe it depends on the nature of the work.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, I think that's a little bit surprising and not quite what we were expecting. And then the question is to figure out why is that the case,
Yeah.
and that's where I'm coming back to psychological safety, because Amy Edmondson, who's like the biggest, most well-known researcher and professor in the area of psychological safety, she's also finding that psychological safety seems to be increasing as a result of working remote. So I wonder why that could be, right? It might be because we're doing a bit better job right now of checking in with each other, but that's already telling us something, right? So if someone's working remote, then the act of taking the time to check in is making a difference. And I think it might also be about that when we work remotely, for example, on video conference, we're more deliberate about how we work. So we're more careful about, taking it in turns to speak, and we're not likely to kind of talk over each other as much. We have to just be a little bit more conscious about the way we work. And I have, this is my theory, that actually we're kind of designing the work effectively. And we're also finding out, when do we need to be on video conference and when is it better to work offline? So maybe there's some really good learnings that we can apply for remote work going forward. And
Yeah.
that's my big wish, actually, is that organizations will actually take the time to see
Yeah.
what they've learned, to
Yeah.
design it differently, and to not just, lose all of those learnings, really.
Yeah, and that's what I'm really hoping, actually, because I've heard such mixed stories as the world now reopens and people are shifting back. So some people have decided that they'll work remotely permanently, but I've also heard of companies who are just, and employees as well, who are just quite eager to get back to the office setting because they miss that interaction, that sort of thing. But also I've been hearing some employees complaining, saying that their bosses they want them to rework in the way, they want them to pick up the old way of working and put remote working aside because that's no longer needed. So it's really, it's kind of like this, trying to get back to the old normal as opposed to embracing the lessons that this whole period has taught us. So it is quite interesting. Yeah.
But that's what we have to do, right, Rochelle, with this conversation and getting the message out there that it's not that working remotely is good or bad, and it's not that working in person is good or bad. It's just that you need to figure out when is the time to work remotely, and when sometimes it's better and sometimes it's better to meet in person. And
and to be open to it, to be continually open to it, and have these structures and mechanisms in place. So where it is needed, you can make that switch very quickly. So what would you say also, because in a lot of bureaucratic companies where we mention digitalization, or where we mention increased agility, remote working, and increased use of independent contractors as well, a lot of employees, like permanent employees, become afraid of their value within the company. Does the company still need me in the future? What would you say to to the employees this time, who are worried about that organizational redesign and worried that that might mean their job is gone or they are no longer needed? What do you say to them?
Yeah. What actually worries me is this really extreme pressure on cutting costs.
Yeah.
And in my customer network, when I'm talking to people, leaders are saying they really feel this huge pressure on cost cutting, and often that's translating to cutting jobs, right?
Yeah.
And if a company is trying to reduce bureaucracy or reduce layers of management just with the goal of cutting costs, I think that can be dangerous, right? Because if you're just taking out resources and not changing the way of working, then you're just going to have maybe worse performance. You're probably going to limit innovation. You're going to limit the long-term sustainable health of the company, not to mention the people that are left there, right? So the way it should be happening is that companies are redesigning the way they work to make it better, to make it fit better for their strategy, and reducing bureaucracy in order to make the company healthier and work better. And then if you've got a thriving organization that's growing, then people shouldn't be worried about job security so much. I mean, I know that sounds a bit idealistic, but actually the point is to make the company healthier, to make the company better. And then it's also better for people who work there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a lot to be said as well for reskilling, where you have a company that's replacing a lot of old processes with, let's say, a more automated digital process. There needs to be a lot of conversation around, okay, if this person's skill is no longer needed within this area, what is the new skill that we need with the introduction of this technology, and how can we enable these workers or these employees to be able to provide that? So maybe that could help with allay some of the fears, but of course there's still always that sort of pressure as well, or let's say that concern from employees.
Definitely, it's understandable, and especially right now when because of the pandemic, there's kind of really widespread economic hardship. And I know people that are really affected by that. But I think if people can afford to do it, if they're in a situation where they can learn some new skills right now, then that could be, maybe one of the best things that you can do to invest in yourself, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So it needs to be a mindset shift, not only on the leader's part, but also on those that make up the workforce, the employees, the entrepreneurs and so forth as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, I think that's what we know from working outside of an
Yeah.
organization is that you're constantly kind of reinventing and learning new things. If you're inside an organization, you might not see things in the same way. You might not see the need to, really learn and stretch. But again, I think it's the best investment you can make in yourself for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I was joking to someone recently that through just even launching the podcast, I feel like I've learned so many skills and the processes with a complete learning curve. I feel really techie now. So I totally
Doing great.
Thank you. So what would you say then? What key messages would you give to leaders in bureaucratic organizations with regards to facilitating more agile and remote work, but also in terms of managing those relationships with external stakeholders?
Yeah. Well, I think that for leaders, the good leaders, they've got at least a little glimmer of inspiration about what is possible,
Yeah.
and maybe I guess maybe they're still feeling like it's a bit of a threat or an uncomfortable feeling that
Mm-hmm.
things are changing, that they won't have the same kind of authority and control that they had anymore. But I think the opportunity there is for leaders to, I guess I would say, it's not that they're stepping down and they're losing their control, but
Mm-hmm.
instead they're inviting more people to step up
Yeah.
and to share with them the accountability. And it's, I think you used the word inclusive, which is great. It's include
Yeah.
more people,
Yeah.
because it's all those diverse talents and skills and different experiences people have
Yeah.
that are going to help you. So
Yeah.
it's how do you design the way to make the most of all those diverse talents?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. One of the things that we found in our white paper, where we were seeing a mismatch of work expectations and the expectations of, let's say, the client versus the independent contractor and so forth. One of the things that was really highlighted to us is the lack of recognition for those external partners because they're not feeling a part of the team, but also a lot of the problems that you face within the organization are also faced within the digital sphere. So for example, some persons mentioned to us about issues of discrimination, and they feel that within that space as well. So it's really, I agree with you in terms of stressing the point on inclusivity. That is when you're considering how to enhance that experience for those within the organization, you also need to consider that given the change in the workforce to those that you're externally engaging as well, what can you do as a company? Because there is some responsibility to those workers as well. So I totally agree. Yeah.
Point. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's been, I think you've made some really interesting points there, especially with regards to the control as well, that need to let go of control. Because I think that's sometimes if it can feel like a threat to a lot of leaders, they feel like they're losing a part of their company, or they're losing, let's say, what comes around that control. So I think that's pretty important. Can you think of any best practice examples where you've had a company that's been, let's say, very set in their ways, and then they came around to, let's say, a more agile and progressive approach?
Well, this is not so much examples
Yeah.
from my own customers,
Yeah.
but there's some great case studies from big companies. And,
Yeah.
I can also, I don't know if you have the comment section, I can also share some more links about that kind of thing, or I have
Yeah.
them on my
Sure.
website.
Yeah.
But some great examples are ING in the Netherlands, which is
Mhm.
a banking in
Yeah.
the banking industry.
Yeah.
And they've switched from a quite traditional bureaucratic hierarchical way of working
Mhm.
into agile teams. I mean, so they've really managed to implement agile
Yeah.
very successfully.
Yeah.
And what happened there is actually, there was definitely a mindset shift needed.
Yeah.
And some people decided not to make the change. Some people left, but
Yeah.
the people had to really think about the change they made.
Yeah.
And another fantastic example is actually out of China,
Mm.
which is a really big and famous white goods manufacturer called Haier.
Yeah.
And they've been around, many, many years. They're an old company, but they've
Yeah.
completely transformed their ways of working again and again.
Yeah.
And they use technology to connect people, and to have, have teams working in small autonomous teams that report to the customer.
Yeah.
It's really incredible and innovative. So that's another great example to look at.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I like where you say report to the customer. I know in my country that would scare a lot of people because sometimes I know customer service is always an area that we're trying to improve on. And often where you have a mindset where you're answering only within the company and not focusing on the external customer, then it will influence the way in which you choose to work and how you present as well. So I totally agree.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you're in, I think a lot of your network and my network too are in the area of HR. So if you're in the functions like HR and finance and IT, it's really a big shift because, it's not that anymore. Maybe the organization is almost reporting to HR and following the rule, but the challenge is to how to figure out the way to be in service of the customer and the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's to be mindful of that as an employee and as a worker as well. And also as a leader, that it's not just about, because I've heard horror stories of bad interfaces with customers, or customers are treated like, I don't know, an afterthought. But whereas you are within your company and you start to focus actually on, you are not just trying to finish your work to please your boss. You're trying to finish your work and finish this product to create and deliver a good service or product to the customer, who's the end user. Then that mindset shift occurs in the way in which you work and how you deal with people, and also even that interaction with your boss. So I think that's really important.
Yeah, and you talked about agile quite a bit, and that's the, I guess, the philosophy that's built into agile methodologies, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you so much. We're just about running out of time, and I really appreciate it. We're actually on perfect timing, so I really appreciate a lot of what, yeah, excellent. I really appreciate a lot of what you shared with us. You really flagged some interesting points, especially where you mentioned about control, you mentioned about trust, you mentioned about the customer involvement. So thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us. And just before you go, like anybody else on our show, I have to harass you for your one funny travel story. So what do you have for us?
All right. So I know you're a big traveler as well, like I am. So, but I want to tell you about a time when I lived in Shanghai for 3 years, and that was, it was a life-changing experience. I loved that. But I want to tell you about one time when I was with another Australian friend in Shanghai, and we were walking through one of the big parks that are in Shanghai, and we accidentally stumbled across an area which is called English Corner. We didn't know it was there. We just accidentally wandered through. And what it is it's a certain point where everyone knows that if you want to practice your English, you can go to this place on a Sunday and practice English with them. So as two foreigners wandering past, we got immediately accosted by people wanting to practice their English. And they explained the whole idea to us. So we're like, okay, we want to help. We'll talk English with you. It seemed like everyone else there was local Chinese, and we were the two foreigners standing there. And so people were just coming, dozens of people were coming up to us, and they were all trying to engage in a conversation with us in English, all at the same time. And so, I'm someone who I like to help. So I was trying to have conversations with them, but more and more people just kept coming. And so until I suddenly realized, my friend and I, we were standing back to back, kind of like in a defensive circle position. And there was this whole circle of people around us, multiple layers of people, all speaking to us in English. And out of the corner of my ear, I could hear my friend. She was starting to make up stories like, oh, I had a pet kangaroo when I was a child, and you have to watch out for these giant spiders that come into your house in Australia. So eventually we were trying to move out of there. We were just kind of moving step by step away, but the whole circle kept following us. So we had to kind of break away and run off. But that was one of those just funny, joyous, crazy moments that you have as a foreigner in China.
Impromptu speaking engagement. As soon as you said your friend began to tell you began to make up these stories, I was about to ask, was she Australian too? Because
Yes.
all of my Australian friends have tried to play that classic prank on me, where they give me some crazy story from Australia. I had a guy that convinced me once that Australians had toilet sharks.
Yeah, that's the
Classic
thing
thing.
we do.
Yeah, and drop bears, and I was afraid for a very long time. But I know better now. I know to second guess your
So
story.
you knew I didn't tell a story about drop bears, which would have been a very Australian thing to do.
Very, very. I believed in it for at least a month, but then someone. But no, thank you so much for sharing with us and for joining us on an episode of Remotely Speaking. So
Thank you.
hopefully you continue to listen to our other episodes. And we just also want to thank our listeners as well for joining us and for welcoming Jodie as well. So we have here Jodie Goulden from stumbling my words.
OrgDesign Works.
OrgDesign Works. There we go. You can tell it's a Saturday. Yeah, OrgDesign Works. So check out our website if you want to know more about what's the best way to redesign your organization to make it more agile and productive and to reduce that bureaucracy. So thank you so much for listening. And this has been another episode of Remotely Speaking. Take care for now. Bye.